Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
For almost 40 years, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, the Jesuit-educated Marxist, was cock of the walk in Zimbabwe. Today, he's under arrest. A good turn that went on far too long.
And worse, tried to go on longer by installing his grasping, greedy wife as his vice president, with her multi-million-pound homes in Dubai, South Africa, Singapore, and Malaysia, and her son showering champagne over a Rolex just because he can. Actually, because his daddy rules the whole country.
An old-fashioned morality tale there. Our first guest was my fellow traveller to Zimbabwe almost 30 years ago. Unbelievably, at least in her case, we've been friends for almost 40 years. We disagreed about Zimbabwe then, and I've little doubt we'll disagree again today, but that's the pluralism of RT. She's Kate Hoey, MP for Vauxhall, and co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Zimbabwe, and she joins us now. Kate, welcome back.
Thank you.
In the last few minutes, the erstwhile vice president, the crocodile, has tweeted that the president has agreed to stand down and that the nation will be addressed shortly. Does all this come as a surprise to you, or have you been expecting it?
Well, over the last few months, we've seen the real disagreements within ZANU-PF, and it was clear that there was this great fight going on to who's going to take over, because Mugabe was 93. Even if he wanted to stay on, he's probably might not have been able to for much longer. And this culminated, of course, in Mnangagwa, who was the vice president, who was the great ally of Mugabe for all those years, being sent, literally expelled from the country. And clearly the army don't like that. The military have always been a supporter of Mnangagwa. They didn't like Grace Mugabe, who nobody really likes. Nobody wanted her to be leader. And I think what surprised me is just how quickly the army acted. And of course, from what we hear, it sounds like they had been planning this and had got support from some other international...
it seems that, though the Chinese are denying it, it seems that this was run past the Chinese
Well,
military,
I think they didn't want to lose the Chinese investment. And of course, investors, as you know, want stability, even if it's stability under, you know, not a particularly good ruler. So I think what we will see, but I think what we have to remember, and I know we'll agree on this, you know, whatever we think of Mugabe, there is still in Zimbabwe a kind of reverence about him that even when people disagree with him and don't like what he's doing, they'll still, you know, he's a kind of father figure. And therefore, I didn't think they would do anything radical like, you know, kick him out of the country.
Or kill him.
Or kill him, or even try him for anything, because all these people who are around him are just as implicated in what's been going on.
That's why it's been the most peaceful coup ever, really.
Yes, it is a coup, but it's not a military coup in the sense that the military want to run the country. They just want to be the power brokers behind whoever's running the country. And of course, the money. We mustn't forget the huge amount of money that people like Mnangagwa and Mugabe's and the others, and indeed the army leaders, have made out of the Marangi diamonds.
I was never a Mugabe. No. I was an Nkomo supporter. So even in those days, I took the Russian line. There is a proper reverence, isn't there? Because this is a man who sacrificed a lot, was tortured, was imprisoned, was a guerrilla leader. If not for him and the people who he led, white, racist, apartheid, Rhodesia would have continued, perhaps for many years longer. It's right that he's not harmed in any way or unduly humiliated, isn't it?
Well, I don't think he will be humiliated in that sense, but you're absolutely right. He was seen at the time by all leaders all over the world as the great liberator of a country that had gone into, gone its own way with Ian Smith and all the terrible things that happened. And for the first few years, it really did look like Zimbabwe was going to be a flourishing nation. In his first message to the people, he said, I want everybody to be involved in my government. The country was clearly doing very well. Education had been carried on. Some of the good things that that Ian Smith's government had done over the years was being kept. The education was still there, health service. And then I think maybe it was just something that happens to people if they stay in power too long. He became distinctively moved away from listening to people, and that was when opposition started to grow within his own party and with other small opposition groups, and he didn't like that. And that culminated eventually in the setting up many years later of the MDC and an official opposition. And because that was backed by a number of white farmers, Mugabe cleverly was able to say, this is MDC's being supported by white people, they've got our land, and then they used that as the opportunity to go in and get support from people who did want more land, and there was a need for land redistribution, but it needed to be done in a way that everybody was kind of bought into it, and so we saw some terrible things happening.
But if you have an indigenous African population that has had to fight for its liberation, but still sees that the big farms are owned by white people, there's an inevitable contradiction there.
Yes, and there was a need, and I think it was beginning to happen with some of the better farmers, that they were training up workforce so that they could actually take over some giving separate bits of land. But it was always going to be something that was hanging over the whole of the country, that the land issue was so unfairly distributed that could not have been ignored. And of course, money was given by, indeed, our government, British government, to actually try and sort some of that.
Well, it was promised. Was it actually given by Mrs. Thatcher?
This is where Claire Short always said that it had been, and various people said in Zimbabwe that it hadn't been. And I think it's probably a little bit of each. I'm not quite sure where the money did go. Certainly some money given. But what I find very sad, when I went back in 2005, and I had to go undercover because at that time there was very bad relations and they didn't want any British MPs there. What was so sad, because we went back and visited some of the big farms that had been taken over, and there you could see the neglected little health centre, the neglected school falling to pieces. The machinery had been sort of stolen by different people. And if those farms had been taken over and Mugabe had allowed the resources of the country to go in to help really make them produce food, which was what Zimbabwe used to be, fed the whole of Africa, that might have been different. But it was very much about the political message lumped together with greed. And so a lot of the farmers were given to just friends of Mugabe so it was difficult to sort of support what Mugabe was doing, or the way he was doing it, even if the issue of principle was probably what needed to happen eventually.
I was going to ask you about the greed thing. I did say it was an old-fashioned morality tale. When you have a liberation leader who's married to someone who owns 4 homes in 4 different countries, all of them palatial sprawls, when you have a first lady whose son takes a picture of himself pouring champagne over a Rolex just because he can, as Gayatri said, this is a kind of classic tale. Do you mark the decline to it now seems unfortunate marriage to the woman who next week was going to become the vice president?
Well, I think everyone says, and I never met her, but Mugabe's first wife, Sally,
quite saintly,
was a very sensible person who apparently was very good at kind of a figure behind him who kept him on the straight and narrow, putting it in that kind of way. Once she died, and I think he was obviously very upset by that, and then he got involved with this other secretary who was his secretary. Well, that's irrelevant, really. But she then a bit like a lot of people, when they get that access to money and power and all the kind of, you know, way that, the attention, she became almost worse than him. And I mean, I think that's what's been happening over the past few years. That she was the one who was going out, because she was who she was able to do what she wanted and speak in his name, even if he hadn't actually asked her. So
the last time I met him was in Malaysia. Little did I know that they had bought
a big house.
A big house there, very big. That's the last time I met him. That would be best part of a decade ago. He was still a figure, you know, internationally. In Africa, I think, though you'll know more about that than me, his role as a liberation leader never really left him, and quite rightly. How sad do you think Zimbabweans will feel today that he's under house arrest and presumably under some kind of duress to resign the post?
Well, I think you're right about the African Union, and in a way that was partly the reason the Zimbabwean situation was allowed to go on, because the African Union, particularly South Africa under Mbeki, didn't really want to ever challenge him, and he could do dreadful things and then go to a big international African conference where they stood to applaud him. You know, they really, really made a hero of him. And I think there will be, there'll be a lot of people saying today, great, but I think there'll be a lot of people who will be having some sense of he is still the father of the nation. My worry, George, and it really is a worry, is that the world internationally will say, this is fantastic. We have now got a new Zimbabwe start for Zimbabwe. And of course, if Mnangagwa, although he may be clever enough to realise he's got to keep the international body, you know, people on board if he wants to get the country moving, he may be clever enough, but we can't forget his past. And his past, in terms of what happened in Matabele and the 20,000 odd people who were massacred just after, a few years after independence, you know, that will never be forgotten by the Zimbabwean people. So I think we have to be very careful that the British government and international opinion don't just sort of rush in and say, this is wonderful. We need to make sure that we're talking. And sometimes I worry about our embassies abroad, that they talk to the same sort of people. Of course. And what they need to do is to be out there talking to the trade union movement and the various groups of Zimbabwean civil society who might not see things in the way that our ambassador would and report back. And we need to just be clear that we want to listen to Zimbabweans must decide their future. And the crucial thing now is to get genuine, free and fair elections. And if Mnangagwa can come up with a way that actually allows a real free election with, you know, perhaps Morgan Tsvangirai having one last shot or whoever, then there's a chance that Zimbabwe could move forward. But until we get that, it will be just the change of one pretty ruthless dictator, despite his history, to another ruthless dictator who has an even less glorious history.
Kate Hoey, MP, thanks for joining us on a momentous day for Zimbabwe, whichever way you look at it.
Thank you.
Coming up next, a member of the British Empire. It's Natasha Devon MBE.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Our next guest is amongst the 500 most influential people in Britain, according to the Sunday Times. She's a best-selling author and in-demand speaker who's headed for Parliament right after this interview. She's a writer on the Times educational supplement, and in fact, she's written her name all over Fleet Street.
She writes about mental health, self-esteem, against bullying and on body image.
She's Natasha Devon MBE, and she joins us now. Natasha, thanks for coming on the Sputnik. We were this morning, just before coming here, at a session involving Grenfell disaster survivors. It was quite harrowing, actually, even all these months afterwards, the damage that it's still doing to the people who didn't die, never mind the now 71 official deaths. But one of the things that struck me about the session was that everyone who was there was a woman. And someone innocently enough asked, what about the men? And it turns out that the men don't really show up for any of these kind of talks. They're not present mainly in the counselling and so on, grief counselling, and people are just damaged by it who were busy task deflected in the immediate aftermath, but are now really sunk in quite serious depression. Is this, from your experience, common? Is it a man thing?
Well, I think what happens is there is a perception that there is less need amongst boys and men for mental health services because boys and men tend to talk less about the needs that they have. And that becomes self-perpetuating because if mental health is the Cinderella service of health, then male mental health is the Cinderella service of mental health. There is so little research that's put into interventions which would resonate with men, language that men would respond to. So the stuff that's out there, particularly in schools, if you think about school counsellors, it's a very feminine environment that boys don't tend to interact with. And so, of course, they don't open up as much, and that becomes a vicious circle in a way.
Well, you see, I recognised what they were talking about because I can't imagine any circumstances in which I would go to counselling that I would turn up to a middle-class, inevitably, woman and cry in front of her or confess to my deepest feelings. So I made the point that this is not actually specific to the demography of the Grenfell Tower survivors. It's not because they're Muslim men or Arab origin men. It's because they're men. And it's about the name you give it, isn't it? Does it have to be called counselling? Do you have to feel that you're going for treatment? Are there ways that we can massage this?
Well, I've been doing some research in schools with sixth form boys, so that's between 16 and 18, and asking them about environments where they feel comfortable talking. And they do have areas where they seek support from each other, and it's places like the gym, if they're on sports teams, the rugby club, whilst driving. When you ask them about teachers that they have a good relationship with, you'll quite often find that those teachers will walk and talk with them. So there's something about having activity alongside talking that a lot of people who are kind of masculine-minded find easier. And I'm fine with that. I don't care how men talk. It's that they talk that's important to me. But you do see, we've got community sports centres being closed down in their droves. The average state school child does 1 hour of physical education per week. Wow. So we're seeing less and less of those kinds of environments available for men and boys.
Yeah. So you've been very vocal about mental health issues, body image, self-esteem, and I believe a month ago you've launched mental health media charter. Can you tell us about it?
Well, it struck me that there's a lot of really bad mental health reporting out there. The awareness raising has been magnificent. We've got royalty now talking about mental health. Who would have thought? But there's still a lot of lazy rhetoric. And I don't think it's deliberately malicious. I just think that it's people have fallen into bad habits. So one example would be using the phrase commit suicide. You commit a crime. It hasn't been a crime to take your own life since 1961. So it's now recommended by most charities that you would say take your own life or end your own life. But still you see the term commit suicide everywhere. And it does contribute to the stigma. When you talk to people who have either survived a suicide attempt or bereaved families of somebody who's taken their own life, it bothers them. So I came up with a media charter, which is a really simple 8-point document, which just gives advice to media outlets who want to report on mental health responsibly and helpfully.
I mean, I'm myself guilty of it as a broadcaster of thousands of programs on television and radio. I myself can say, that's bonkers, or, even worse than that. I don't want to tell you, you'll hate me. Ward 5 in Broadmoor, that kind of put down. How do we shake ourselves out of this? How do you shake me out of it?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to acknowledge that people's intention. So what I put in the media charter was, we will do our best. Because I acknowledge that particularly if you work in a fast-paced newsroom, things are going to slip through the net. And that's okay. It's that people intend to do good that is the main thing. And if you always just intend to be kind and also to report accurately, you won't go far wrong. So, for example, a lot of people say Donald Trump is mental. But that, I think, does a massive disservice to people who genuinely have mental illnesses and would never behave in that way, you see.
Definitely. Now, you've got a book, actually, coming up. Tell us about that, because the title of it is a knockout.
It's called A Beginner's Guide to Being Mental. I am, as somebody who has a mental illness myself, I'm trying to reclaim that word and to make people realize that if you have a brain, you have a mental health, that mental illness is only one tiny corner.
Not just negative.
Of that conversation, exactly. And it struck me that whilst we're all talking a lot more about mental health, that there's still a lot of misunderstanding. People don't quite understand the words that they're using or how to have conversations with the people around them. So it's supposed to be a guide for absolutely everyone with a brain to better enable them to do that.
We're all mental. I think it's a good slogan.
Yes.
We had recently on the show the man at Royal Mail who's in charge of well-being and including spotting signs of problems in the mental health area. Royal Mail, which is in some respects a controversial employer, and I would say in some respects a bad one. But on this, they seem to be going an extra mile that not all employers are. Is that your experience? Most employers, it seems to me, are really not spotting or even trying to spot mental health problems, and then their company and the rest of the workforce, not to mention the employee with the mental health problem, are paying the price.
Well, you find particularly in the public sector that there's a lot of pressure being put on teachers, for example, in my experience, to not talk about the mental health issues that they are experiencing as a direct result of the pressured environment that they work in, because that kind of gives schools a bad rep. So there's a lot of silencing going on, a lot of people being encouraged not to take time off work when they're having mental health struggles. And my experience is that with a lot of employers, it's almost like if we acknowledge this, there's going to be a whole other world of obligation placed upon us. So there's almost a fear of opening that Pandora's box. But what they don't understand is that they're already dealing with it. You know, back pain, 90% of back pain is caused by mental health problems because your body has to store that tension somewhere. Stress is a mental health problem. You know, it's the second biggest loss of money in the employment sector in terms of absence, time taken off. So if you're an employer, you're already dealing with it, and it's just incumbent on you, I think, to learn how to deal with it better.
What do we mean, just in closing, by mental health problems? For someone of my age and class, mental health problems is somebody pushing somebody onto a railway line or going berserk and killing people. But of course, that can't be true because so many people have mental health problems at some time in their life.
It's true. And if I said to you, I've got a physical health problem, it'd be absolutely ridiculous for me to expect you to know what I meant, because that could mean anything from I've got a cold to my leg's broken to I've got diabetes. You know, you don't know. Mental health covers a really, really wide gamut. It means everything from, you know, I've got mild depression, I'm finding it difficult to cope with stress, to something like bipolar or schizophrenia, which can mean that you can experience hallucinations. But the important thing to bear in mind is that 99% of people who have mental health problems of whatever type are far more likely to harm themselves than they are anyone else. And one of the things in the mental health media charter is actually, you know, if you're going to say the terrorist had mental health problems, first of all, what specifically did they have? What was their diagnosis? And also recognize that there's other things that led them to that point, you know, radicalization, desperation, that it wasn't simply their mental health which caused them to become dangerous.
Is it getting worse, and are we getting better at rising to the challenge?
I think we are. There's a lot of good intention out there, which is great. You know, I'm part of an organisation called Mental Health First Aid England, and they go into schools, workplaces, and also into the armed forces, teaching people the signs and symptoms they should be looking out for, and also how to be supportive, how to do non-judgmental listening, that kind of thing. And when you're involved in an organisation like that, you see how much good intention there is out there, which is really encouraging, I think.
Now, your beginner's guide to being mental comes out when?
Next year in May.
Can I pre-order?
Of course, yeah.
Natasha Devon MBE, thanks for joining us
Thank
on
you.
the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So what were actually Mugabe's main achievements in all his years in power, and what now for Zimbabwe? Tim Warner says he chucked out the colonialist and made himself rich beyond the dream of avarice. Ironically, he was the British government's poster boy, but I doubt Nkomo would have been any different. And I must mention this one from Rob Perry, who says, there's at least one tailor weeping right now.
Comrade Bob, as I came to know him as, did have a rather eccentric choice in suits, but it was an African thing.
A thing, yes.
But your first tweeter makes a powerful point. Mugabe was favoured by the British. He was favoured by the West because Nkomo was thought to be a Russia man, thought to be a Soviet man. And frankly, Nkomo was the better choice for leader.
Well, that's all the time we've got for the tweets today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today, or on Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.